All right. Photography. Just before we get started today, I want to say this video is sponsored by my parents. They've paid for most of everything I own, but I'm working on it. Today we're going to talk about exposure. It's the simplest thing about photography and the most essential, especially if you're trying to get into film photography, because you can't look at your screen anymore. Okay, let's just get into it. The exposure triangle. There's three things that affect the brightness and darkness of your image. There's the ISO, there's the shutter speed, and the aperture. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. ISO, and all of those settings on a camera affect how your image comes out, whether it be darker or lighter. Let's start with ISO. ISO is usually the thing you move around a lot on a digital camera to adjust for your exposure, especially while you're filming things. But when it comes to film, it's your film speed. So that you can't really adjust it. You pick it. Usually it comes in 100, 200, 400, 800, and 1600. And that's the highest ISO film that you would usually get. When we're dealing with film ISO, the higher the ISO, usually the grainier the final photo is. And that's what you're after. Okay, you're trying to shoot film. You want grain. Everyone loves grain. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is how fast your shutter goes. So it's usually based around a second. So the fastest a lot of film cameras go is one thousandth of a second. That was hard to say for me. Don't judge. So that would be the darkest because it's the fastest and allowing in the least amount of light. So if you start from that and you start going slower, like 1/800ths, 1/500, 1/400, 1/200, 1/100, 1/50, then you're starting to let more light in, and you're also letting more time pass, right? So there's more light in. If you've heard about a long exposure, that's letting a lot of light in, but usually you wouldn't want to move things, objects, or your subjects in a long exposure because it'll come out blurry instead of being a still image because it's capturing all that motion and light that's coming in. And lastly, there's aperture. Aperture is basically the amount of light your lens is letting in. So imagine that man, why is my first analogy butthole? Let me think of a better one. Okay, imagine my face is the camera and my mouth is the lens. My aperture changing is basically like this. So big aperture, small aperture. Wide aperture, narrow aperture. I don't know the other way to say it. So if we were to be at f2.5, which is an aperture, we would have a very wide aperture. We would call that wide. So and if we were at f16, we would be at the tiny aperture, letting in less light. And what that means is that when you're letting in less light, you get a darker image, and when you're letting in more light, you're getting a brighter image. What changing the aperture also does is controlling the depth in your photo. So right now my camera has an aperture of f4, and it's kind of focused on me. I'm bad at focusing, but I know for sure that if I stick my hand out here, first of all, you can't hear. First of all, you wouldn't have heard me better. My hand would be out of focus, and my face would be more in focus. Yeah. So if I were to move here, I'd be out of focus. But if I'd be here, I'd be in focus. If I had a more shallow, so like a higher number, F number, I would have more latitude to move. and still be in focus. But a lot of people like shallow depth of field because it makes it look like photography. At this point, I want to cover stops. Stops is just a degree that we measure exposure in. So if you ever heard someone go, hey, I want something to be a stop brighter or stop down or stop up, they're talking about degrees of exposure, and you would change that with the 3 settings I just mentioned. How you count stops with ISO is usually you double the number, and that's a stop. So there'd be ISO 100, so there'd be 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 128000. I added an extra 0. That's how you count stops with ISO. On shutter speed, it's the same thing. A stop is usually double what it was. So if we started at 1/1000th, 1/500th, 1/500 is one stop brighter, and then 1/250 is another stop brighter, and then 125 is another stop, and then usually around to 160, and then 130, 115, 1/8, rounding again, 1/4, 1/2, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 16 seconds. You get the point. And then lastly, there's aperture. We measure aperture in f-stops. If there's a really wide camera lens, it would start at f1.4. So if you would go a stop up, that'd be 2, and then up f2, and then it'd be up, it'd be f2.8, and then f4, and then f5.6, and then f8, and then f11, and then f16, and then f32. Those are one stop, going one stop darker every time. Usually there's a lot of meters in everything that you're using when it comes to photography. Most cameras would have a meter inside of it that just tells you what settings you should do, and you do those settings. Some cameras don't. You can use an app on your phone, or you can buy a separate light meter. Sekonic makes the best ones. I used to have one. I don't know where it is, and it kind of pisses me off because those are kind of expensive. But I've been getting by. And sometimes when I'm feeling confident that day and I trust myself, I'll just follow the Sunny 16 rule, the Sunny 16 rule just says if it's sunny outside, you put your aperture on f16 and you match your shutter speed with your ISO. So for example, if I had a ISO 100 film in, I would put on a sunny day, if I had ISO 100 film, I can trust that if I put it on f16 and my shutter speed at 1/100, that I'll get a good image. So depending on how I want to change the settings, I could just adjust each things to make equivalent exposures. So we were talking about f16 being one stop away from f11. So if I made it brighter from f11 so I could get a more shallow depth of field, I could bump up my shutter speed 1/100th to 1/200th to get the equivalent exposure. And that's how you use the Sunny 16 rule. So yeah, these videos are really fun. I want to make more of them, but making the subject about film is kind of tough, because when it comes to film, you kind of have to decide on a daily basis whether you want food or another sweet roll of Cine Still. So if I could get some support from you guys, that would help a lot. Just like a like, maybe, and then maybe if you think this video is helpful, you could share with a friend. That's it. Yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Tell me what I should make a video about. Thanks.